Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Conscious Conversations, sponsored by the House of H. I am Juno, and today's guest is Christopher. Christopher, say hello, please.
Hello, Bill.
Um, Christopher, for those of us out there who maybe are not sure of who you are, where you are in the world, give us an introduction. Tell us about yourself a little bit.
My name is Christopher William Moon. I'm a 51-year-old gay male in Rhode Island. I like to define myself, though, as being more than that. I am an artist, as well as uh, I studied a lot in psychology, as well as biblical studies, as well as went for my master's in divinity, before choosing to walk in the humanitarian efforts that were apart from the church, but still fed my spiritual needs.
Cool. So, getting an MDiv must have been cool. What inspired that? We're gonna do this a
Mm,
little out of order, but because that like intrigued me.
what inspired wanting to get a master's in divinity? You know, I worked right before that as a risk analyst for reinsurance companies, and for a period of 6 years, I helped insurance and reinsurance companies and investors not lose money when major catastrophes happened. And I would joke to my friends that I was the devil's handmaiden. You know? And it sort of like grated, I said that because it grated me a little bit. There was something intrinsically, I'm not going to use the word wrong about it. There was something that intrinsically took from society instead of giving back to
Mm.
people. It was like giving to corporations instead of people. And I had spent most of my life on a spiritual path, uh, trying to seek out God and goodness and to help people in general. I began my journey by becoming an evangelical Christian when I was 16 years old. Um, I um, I left that movement early on, at 22, when Moody Bible Institute had me go to reparative therapy. Um, and I
When
was
you say when you say reparative therapy, do you mean like conversion camp type stuff?
Yes. Um,
Interesting.
I went to Moody Bible Institute to study to become a pastoral counselor because I saw that there was a great need for counseling within the church, not only to lay people, but also to people that were in ministry, because a lot of the pressures of being in ministry led to profound family dysfunctions. And I wanted to be able to help address that within the church. When I came out to my RA, he told the school, and the school told me that the only ministries that I would ever be qualified from then on out would be ex-gay ministries. And so they hooked me up with a group called Exodus in New Hampshire, which is a reparative therapy group. They base themselves off of the 12 steps. And my,
So they treat queerness almost like an addiction.
yes, a sexual
Interesting.
addiction. Um, so my academic advisor, though, and God bless his soul, said to me, "I do not want you to become a member, a patient, a client, whatever they consider people. I want you to go into this and look at it to see if it is a ministry of God, and you will know that by it having the fruits of the Spirit." And what that pretty much is joy, contagiousness, peace, as well as mental stability. That these kinds of things would inspire healing and joy within people if they were of God. And that that question, that assignment that he gave me, I think saved me a lot from a lot of self-torment later on. Because I would sit at this group and I would just take notes about what was happening in the group, the progress of the different people that were in it, or the lack thereof, and what their lives had started off before the ministry as and what they were becoming now. And what I found was a growing pattern of sickness and people that were putting themselves in high risk situations. Um, Just imagine rural New Hampshire and people feeling delegated to the only way that they could express themselves as being public, I don't know, did I freeze? Let's see, being public sex in bathrooms and such. And,
Yeah,
um, you know, it, I don't condemn those things, but that was the only kind of affection that these men and women had been delegated to. And the church had was pairing them. Exodus was pairing people. So a gay man would be paired with a lesbian female, and they would be a sort of like almost arranged relationships. And the
interesting.
people, yes. And the people were becoming more and more pathological. And there was a lot of dissent within the organization, as well as pain that was being exhibited by people. They would start off each meeting with sort of a 12-step prayer and go on from then. And it occurred to me, like, if this is how evangelicals are doing this, I am curious, what if I add a component of the study by observing, not participating, but just observing how Episcopalian churches were doing this, something similar. Episcopalian churches, instead of trying
So
to,
wait, quick question, because
Mhm.
I don't want to like lose this thought. So you grew up as evangelical or as
No,
Episcopalian?
I grew up as a good, my family was Presbyterian, so I was trained to be a good agnostic, you
Okay.
know.
Okay. So, but let's finish out this section and then I want to jump back kind of to childhood. So continue. But I just that came up for me. Like, what was that like growing up? Okay. Please
Um,
continue.
so I added this component where I went to the Boston Alliance of Gay and Lesbian Youth, which was held in the Episcopalian Church, and it was sponsored and run by laity of the Episcopalian Church. It wasn't like an Episcopalian thing, but it was being sponsored by them and funded by them in its early development. And I wanted to see, what does this organization that goes against the evangelical standard for the Bible, does it display fruits of the Spirit, where this evangelical literal interpretation of three verses in the Bible, all of which I won't even go into that, but the biblical standards for it just doesn't really make any sense. But anyhow, I saw that the kids that were going to this were jovial. I saw that the people that were in it were not predatory, such as the evangelicals had led me to believe, but they were actually just there to make sure that the kids were safe, there to make sure that they had guidance and questions, there to give them information about safe sex and what to do if you're homeless, all these different things.
And one more question. At what point in your timeline is this? Like, how old are you here, and
22,
what year is it?
1997.
Okay. So this is for context, because some of the people watching this, I'm sure, are not necessarily from this time period. Like, the climate of gayness then was much different than it is now. Like, it's almost like back then society was like, it's not the T, it's not okay to be gay, blah. It was kind of volatile, especially post AIDS
Um,
crisis in the 80s. And now it's almost like inverted where society's like, it's not a big deal, but the government is like, no. So it's this very interesting like switcheroo that's happened.
you
But
know, um, you can characterize pretty much the 90s stance on homosexuality by the phrase, don't ask, don't tell.
oh yeah, I actually just interviewed someone just before you who was a Marine in the 90s. And I was like, what was it like to be alive during Don't Ask, Don't Tell and to be in that environment during this? And he had a really interesting story. So yeah, that is a great way to capture it. In fact.
It was okay to be gay, but we don't want to know about it. We don't want to see it. Keep it hidden. Um, which is a weird way of saying we're not okay with it, but we feel wrong about obviously standing against it.
Yeah.
It was a weird conundrum, a mental gymnastics that our society was practicing at the time. And but what I saw within those kids is that this was a group that was growing dynamically, where the other group, the people were becoming very fatigued, very weary, and very hurtful towards one another. Um, it just, it was so much. So yeah, so I remember writing my paper and also my resignation to Moody Bible Institute as a result of that experience. And that I thought it was all over with me and my journey as far as in the church and such. And as being directly involved with it, it was for a while. It was the end of that journey for a good 12 years of my life. But I practiced a lot of meditation in those days. Things like yoga became important to me. Tai Chi became important. Energy work became important as I became involved in Reiki.
Before we pivot into Reiki, I want to jump back to childhood
Hmm.
because I was very intrigued by the MDiv, and then we went through that, and I have more questions about that. But first, I want to go back to the beginning, and I want to know what was it like for you as a child growing up, like when you're figuring out you're queer, or maybe like very early on, you know you're queer or different or gay. And also, how does hearing that word a lot today come up? Because I know that probably during your time period that was used more as a slur than as an empowering word for like a time period queer. Um, but what was growing up gay like in whatever religious or spiritual practice you were brought up in? And how did that begin to shape your early formative years before you decided to go to get an MDiv?
Interestingly enough, the word queer wasn't so much a slur as it was something to say someone was odd. Um, you know,
That's why I
it
like
it
the word.
it didn't mean per se social in my social construct that I grew up in. It didn't mean gay. It meant odd, quirky, not definable. So, like just social deviant pretty much. You know. Um what was it like? I knew that I was attracted to men by the time that I was 3, 4, and I was more interested in Buck Rogers of the 24th century than I was in, Wonder Woman per se.
Yeah.
I didn't have the words for it or the names for it, but I had an understanding of them. It was weird because, I also grew up in a home in which my father was an ex-DC Vice Squad cop, and he and his friends would go to the gun range and they would shoot targets that had pictures of um, people that were supposed to be gay. And I remember him coming home from the gun range without you know, this target that had been shot up and all, and showed a picture of two men holding hands. And he's like, "Hey, do you know what we call that, Chris?" And I was like, "Bad aim." Yeah, because I wasn't gonna buy into it. And he goes, "A good start." So, what it said to me very early on was that the people that I trusted the most, the people that I was supposed to go to for safety, would rather see someone like me dead. And
Yeah, how does that, and how old were you there? And how does that feel?
was about 11 years old.
That's wild. Yeah.
Um, so, and that tied into my spirituality because, you know, when you can't trust the scene world around you and the people that you are supposed to trust the most for your own safety, when they become the source of danger in your life, and you're punished for carrying your books wrong or walking funny, or acting a bit touched. you know as I heard those things many times. I remember like my father looking at my mom once and being like, "Linda, the boy ain't right." you know. And so, I remember like thinking to myself, like, the physical world has betrayed me. And I remember when I hit 16, I went to this Bible camp in which I learned about God who was, I had heard from the church and everything else, but this was a more personable God of the evangelicals that knew everything about me and loved me. Not despite, not in light, but still loved me based on who I was. And that message was alluring. It was
So
dynamic.
before you go to this church camp and
Hmm.
you go and it's like an evangelical church camp, what was your structure like before that? Was it like Roman Catholic? What was the general
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian? Okay. So how did you end up from going from Presbyterian to an evangelical like
We
a
we
camp?
lived in the DC area, and evangelical churches down there are proliferating the public schools with groups such as Young Life, which pose themselves as being student-led groups. They're not student-led groups, they're parachurch organizations that are led by non-ordained men and women who are dedicated to evangelical agendas. They have best intents for the most part, but it's an infiltration of the public schools underneath the guise of student leadership because the students propagate and proliferate the information. So they skirt around rules of church and state separation in public schools.
So as somebody who doesn't have experience with either of those denominations, can you explain the difference to me and to everyone at home?
A parachurch organization is a
Oh,
organization
not that
that
part.
is
Like
okay.
evangelical versus
Okay.
starts with a P.
Presbyterian churches
Presbyterian.
are a branch off of Methodist and such. So, I mean, we had the great church schisms of, say, the first church schism was between the Greek Orthodox and the Catholics. Later on, it was the Catholics and the Episcopalians. When the Episcopalians came to the U.S., they further, as well as the Puritans and the different regions that composed of the British Isles and all, and Germany and other parts of Europe, they formed different denominations, and Presbyterians were more of a predestined type or a denomination that believed they didn't need to be evangelical. They didn't need to go out and tell people what to believe because, well, if you were destined for heaven, you would be in their doors. Um, so, evangelical churches, however, take more of a Baptist view of where they believe that they believe more in free will and free will among all people that we as individuals have the choice of choosing heaven or choosing hell. And if you know the truth, you are obligated then to speak the truth that people have to choose God or they're going to hell. So
Okay.
there's this fundamental difference of belief system that drives a lot of the different politics that you will see from those types of churches.
And so you were saying with this in mind, a parachurch organization or is somewhere that kind of does is not directly affiliated but is loosely affiliated with one of these groups and then they host like an after school program or something that introduces people to the concepts.
So this parachurch organization, Young Life, is sponsored by Baptist as well as Evangelical, Presbyterian, you name it, different churches down south, all with the understanding that they are trying to bring a new generation of kids back to God through the Bible. And they have a very formulatic method where they teach kids about misery, suffering, rejection, loneliness, things like that. And then they're like, but guess what? We got a secret special for you, and they teach people how they're destined for hell, that they're going to hell if
Oh.
things in life doesn't change, right? They're like, because of Adam and Eve and their sin, we're all going to hell because we're all not perfect and only the perfect things can be in heaven. But God came down and love you so much that he laid his life and died for you. Well, the entire concept for me of a divine being become manifest, all for this sake to let me know that I didn't have to suffer as someone who couldn't even see acceptance from his own family was intoxicating. I mean, I bought it hook, line, and sinker because I had always had this sense of connection with spirituality, with the ethereal things that you couldn't see. I remember at a young age telling my mom that I could hear God whispering in the wind, things like that, that, and um, again, touched. Well, the boy, right, Linda. You know, so, I mean, I just developed this instant love. And it was that love of God and that drove me to go into trying to become a pastoral counselor even. It wasn't because I wanted to fix people. It's because I wanted them to know a source that would help heal them as I
hmm
had felt healed. And so the entire aspect of being rejected by the evangelical church was very scarring for me, because I just felt utterly betrayed. I was like, wait, you told me and sold me on this line about God loving me unconditionally, but now you're telling me that you can't?
And that, well, yeah. So my question with that is, at what point during the process of being evangelical did you get sent to this conversion camp?
Um, well, I became evangelical at 16,
Yeah.
and it wasn't until I was 22 that it wasn't a conversion camp. It was a ministry that met on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, much like a 12-step group,
hmm
you know. Um, so yeah, so it was those number of years. So I mean, I had studied the Bible extensively, and it was other people that had come before me, like Jonathan Boswell, who did a in-depth hermeneutical study on the Bible and on the Old Testament and the New Testament and the way where the evangelicals and other churches have used verses to condemn homosexuality. He was like, wait, when we look at these words, they don't mean what you're translating it to mean. They mean other things, you know. This is a case of, when it's in Leviticus or even in Genesis, when they're talking about the Tower of Babel, or they're talking about, say, Babylon and things along those lines, Sodom and Gomorrah and things, that the sins were more about rape. These words were more about rape and about horrible different acts that were occurring of those times that the Israelites were being told not to participate in. So he was like, "Why are we even going there? That is not what the word means." And he was heavily criticized. But if anybody is out there that is looking for someone who has done biblical studies on it, Jonathan Boswell did extensive good writing on it. And his work became a foundation for a lot of different groups that have now gone on to incorporate the LGBTQIA plus community into even the church laity and church professional services like the Episcopalians have, UCC, Unitarian Universalist, all those. It's because of people like Jonathan Boswell that laid that groundwork for reacceptance into the Christian community at large.
It's it's so wild to me that I even just found out yesterday that there's a branch of they're called American Christians or American Catholics or whatever, and they're like not anti-gay at all. They're okay with divorce. They're all of this stuff is fine by them. And I was saying to someone I was speaking to earlier today that I think had that been a conversation, like because I grew up in a Roman Catholic family and I was forced to receive all the sacraments and do all that stuff, and I think had that not been necessarily the storyline for me, I don't know that I would have remained Catholic, but I think it would have stayed longer for me. Like it
Hmm.
would have stuck a little bit longer. Um, and I remember in high school, I knew a bunch of Jewish people. Like a lot of my girlfriends were Jewish, and I didn't necessarily like. I at the time really misunderstood the people who follow Jesus for the actual teachings of Jesus, and so I put a lot of my distaste for them on Jesus and like the that aspect of it. And so originally I thought I wanted to be Jewish for a little bit. But there's this cultural thing when you ask to convert where they intentionally deny you a couple of times, like two, three times. And I didn't know that was a thing. So when I went to a rabbi and I was like, "Hey, I want to be Jewish," and he was like, "You can't be Jewish," and I was like, "Oh, okay." Like that was enough. That was enough for me because I didn't know that there was more to it than that. So
Mm.
sometimes I question if any of that had happened, if I would still be in an Abrahamic-based faith, like for where I'm at now. But I just those things are what led me to exploring earth-based spirituality and more like shamanistic type practices. So after your evangelical phase and going through this um, Alcoholic Anonymous style 12-step program for being queer, what brought you to Reiki? Like, how did you end up there?
Touch on to the statement that you made about staying in the Abrahamic faith. Just something to consider that the church itself was a dumping ground for the LGBTQIA people um, for over 1,000 years. That if you weren't marrying a woman or whatnot, you were considered blessed with a special gift of the spirit in which you could give that part of your life over to God. So it wasn't pretty much until about 100 years ago that a big anti-queer stance stood within Christian fundamental belief systems, and that was based off of a translation of the Bible that was done that was very political. You asked about how did I never felt abandoned by God. I felt rejected by the church. So I just sought God and nature after that. Not that nature was God for me, but God in nature. Remember how I said that I used to tell my mom that I would hear the whispering of God in the wind?
Hmm.
Well, I returned to that. Not even in a shamanistic or in a mystic sense, but simply in a trying to be still you know, that when we are still within ourselves and try to find peace within ourselves, that we can then touch base with the divine. And I really felt that if I could help calm my mind, if I could help silence the turmoil and the different voices of what wasn't even mine, but what was, you know, family or people that I had once placed faith upon, other outside of myself, and their negative voices and such. If I could come to term with that, and I could come to term with uh, different toxic elements in my life and apply healing to that through, gentle movement, meditative movement, as well as meditation, then maybe I could come back to find a higher sense in my life. So I became involved I went to yoga like pretty much 5 days a week. Not that it was a religious practice or anything, but I just loved the way that it helped still me. It helped me quiet. It helped me meditate. And the style of meditation that I would do would be breath awareness as well as breath awareness to the point of detachment you
Hmm.
know and in that, energy work started to become a thing because when you're doing a lot of yoga, you can feel movement within your body and your doshas and such and your chakras. That's a big part of yoga
Yeah.
and, Vedic medicine. So I started reading about Vedic medicines and Tai Chi then became a thing. And, you know, through visualization and meditation and everything else, I felt really connected to that energy work. And so I became attuned for Reiki. And in so doing, just it became like It reminded me of the Christian laying on of hands, where, you're not healing somebody, but you're channeling something that's greater than you onto another person, where you're just sort of being the pathway, the
And
light.
when you say Reiki, is there a specific lineage of Reiki that you've been attuned to or you work with? Because I know there are various
You know,
types of Reiki.
I've stepped away from a lot of the mainstream thoughts about it. I was attuned at the New England School of Acupuncture. It was part of their program that they had, which was very much a Japanese system that claimed to be the original system.
So
Um,
Yasui.
yeah, so that was part of my practice that I was attuned to. Um, I was attuned to Reiki too. And that's become a part even of when I do paintings. I charge my paintings with Reiki energy.
Yeah, I love that. So you said that you stepped away from Reiki though, to an
Well, I
extent.
stepped away from mainstream thoughts about it. Like, so what I mean by that is I haven't kept up to date with what other people say about it and what is the trends now. I was attuned back in 2002. So, it's evolved in the past 23 years, I think.
Like anything, yeah.
You
Things
know?
change over time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's so it's very interesting. So so over the last 22 years, let's take it there. Oh, also, I guess I have a question because it seems like you dove kind of deeply into more Eastern traditions with things like yoga and Ayurveda and stuff like that. So what was not everyone that does yoga does breath work, and not everyone that does breath work does Ayurveda. So like it seems like that was a path that you followed for a while because there was a deepening into it. So what what moved you through those phases of it? What brought you to the place where you were studying Ayurveda outside of just doing the postures? Because for some people, yoga is literally just a series of postures and it does things to their body and it's an athletics thing. But when you do participate with the more spiritual side of yoga and the kind of, I think it's interesting because it goes from what is the Western perception, which is what you were experiencing earlier, where there's like this monotheistic God thing that knows everything and is whatever. And then when you embrace a yogic path, all of a sudden it's like there's multiple deities, but also they're all one thing and they all come from this amorphous place of unknowingness. So I think there's like this, like, what is that transition like when all of a sudden you're going from a structure that is mostly monotheistic to a polytheistic structure through the lens of knowing it in the body? I guess I should qualify.
My When I left the church, I pursued an education in psychology. And, one of my teachers was big on Carl Jung. And Carl Jung ties into Joseph Campbell. So Carl Jung is pretty much, he looked at things like, all these different religions and everything else. There's a collective mind going on here that we're all
Yes.
tapping into the same primal energy. And then
I
Joseph
love
Campbell,
Jung.
what?
I have a master's degree in social work. I love Jung. He does a great I love his explanation of things.
hmm
Yeah. Continue.
So, with Carl Jung, he tied into sort of like, it seems like psychology is not new, people. He was like, psychology is not new. He's like, we will keep saying that, but you got to look at the Bible. Let's look at the book of Job. It's a story of post-traumatic stress disorder. Then how people looked upon it. We have a story in the Bible of, how people were like, they looked at someone who was going through tragedy and they victimized the poor person to the point that he eventually goes, you know, okay, God, why? And God just goes, it happens. You know? And Job's like, okay, well, that sucks. I was like, yeah, it does. Yeah. And, Job re-identifies himself and rebuilds himself. And Carl Jung was sort of like, we got to look at things and sort of realize that we have been touching on to trying to heal ourselves in many different ways for all of our existence. Just because the science part of it might be new does not mean that the endeavor itself isn't new. And that intrigued me. And I dug into that a little bit, and I understood that he was very closely linked in studies and works to Joseph Campbell, who was he's the author of The Hero of Many Faces, where he talks about, there's this sort of shamanistic walk of life that happens in every single culture where there's a story about how society is broken. Then the story goes on that God looks down or the gods look down, and it's like, you know what? We could do something. Maybe we should. And so they send a messenger, or they send a deity in the form of a human to help heal the brokenness of society. And how does that happen? Well, the deity takes upon the pain of mankind and becomes broken himself or herself, and usually into the point of death, and then rises. Well, this exists in Hinduism and stories, as well as within Christianity. It exists within certain traditions that are Asian and such. And South American, even and Egyptian, where we see these stories happening over and over and over, and including a Greek one in which a lot of the mythos around Christ is based upon. But I divert. All this information and these readings and everything else opened me to the path of, well, you know, let's take the let's take things from those different traditions that are now being aligned to helping people with their body and with their psyche. And became interested in Eastern influences into psychology, which led me to meditation and Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. And then yoga just became a part of it because my gym offered it, you know?
Very
And
practical.
yeah, one thing led to another, and before you know it, yoga itself had become a big part of my life, and breath work had become a part of my life. And I would try, I was very open-minded, and so I would try different things. And I remember trying this one thing that presented itself as being a yoga group in Boston, a Korean yoga group, it called itself, and like after a month, I was like, I'm out. I'm cutting it out simply because like they had this entire notion of you were only human if you participated in their rituals. And I was like, well, okay, not going to go there, And I remember telling all my friends, and they were like, well, Chris, if you say it's a cult, then we know it probably pretty much is, you know?
So, question. You post this AA style group for queer people. You're now exploring more Eastern philosophies with spirituality like yoga and Zen Buddhism and things like that. So, where does where does relationship fit into this, and how was navigating your relationships with other queer people romantically or socially during this time period? Because it sounds like this was early 90s, if I'm correct, or like late
Early 2000s now,
early
because I
2000s
didn't come
now.
out until 97. Um,
Okay.
so I had gone through my first relationship with a man from 97 to 2000, and I escaped that as I came to terms with loving myself, I realized that the relationship was abusive. And so I left it. And I remember separating myself largely from things like nightlife and things like that, and pursuing more sort of like dinner groups,
Mm.
having dinner with friends and stuff like that, and hosting dinner parties and things. And also just being heavily invested in my body at the time, as well as my work and my friends, and investing and not not socializing with a bunch of people, but socializing on specific people, honing in on relationships and nurturing those relationships early on.
And so in the early 2000s, when it's like still not fully trendy or cute to be gay, although we did have at that point things like Will and Grace and the L Word and Queer as Folk and things like that happening, where socially it was becoming much more part of the the language here, at least, queerness as something more acceptable, what did what was navigating relationships like in that time period, like the romantic aspect of it and stuff like that.
Scary because, early 2000s, um, HIV and AIDS were still a big thing. And it wasn't until the single pill method of treating HIV, and that became successful, that things like dating or meeting people or having relations with people was something that was more acceptable, and people took more risks. I took more risks in those relationships. And, we weren't as afraid anymore as we were in the 90s, I mean, for those who don't know, in the 90s when I first came out, being gay was almost a death sentence for a lot of people, where they didn't understand really even all the different workings of HIV and AIDS and such. And, we still had people like Rush Limbaugh preaching to the masses that HIV was God's cure for homosexuality, and so it wasn't until there was treatment options available that society was like, well, obviously it's not God's punishment because it's pretty ineffective,
Yeah.
if it's a treatment, So I think that and people don't think about that, but the course treatment of a disease and then that disease being treatable changed a lot of society's willingness to accept homosexuals, and LGBTQIA people, and um, it had its own challenges and everything else, but that was more a part of just navigating relationships in general. And I always considered that the fact that being gay was a controversial thing. It was something that was sort of edgy at the time. That it was a good litmus test for people's bullshit. You
Mm.
know, that
Yes.
it was like, well, I'm queer. I'm here. Deal with it.
Yeah.
It was a large part of the 90s and early 2000s mentality about people's homophobia, and I think regretfully we've seen a resurgence of that where, queer identity has sort of had to re-solidify itself. Um, and hopefully we come together more and more and not splinter off because of society's acceptance or lack thereof.
As a person who did a lot of stuff in queer nightlife and who I really loved queer nightlife in that community, I think that almost culturally we got caught up in how do I say it? Like it's very like the Den of the Lotus Eaters from from the
Odyssey.
yeah, thank you, from the Odyssey. It's like I think socially as a people we kind of got distracted for a long while. And I think there was a lot of splintering that happened in the queer community as a result. And by the way, I'm not in any capacity blaming nightlife at all because I think nightlife is has always been a really great safe space for so many queer people, especially like when they're first coming out and needing to understand and see themselves reflected in other people. I think it serves a really great and it's such a birthplace for art in so many different forms. So thankful for nightlife, not blaming nightlife. But I do think that like culturally we were distracted for a while. And I think that when we were when we're being faced with hate due to this current administration as vocally as it's being spewed towards us now, I think there's this coming together aspect that I feel is happening, at least from the conversations I've had, that um it's almost like culturally queer people are like, okay, it's time to buckle down and do the work again. It's time to do the thing. That's very much what I feel like. But also I've been kind of in the advocacy role since I was younger. Like I started one of the first gay straight alliances in the state of New Jersey. I helped volunteer to get domestic partnership passed before gay marriage was a thing with Lambda Legal and the Human Rights Campaign. And at least like I know I was very distracted away from like social activism for a while, and now with the state of the world, I'm like, okay, we have to get back in this mode. So I think I think socially we're kind of going through a wave pattern at the moment.
Always. And that will continue throughout eternity,
Hmm.
as long as there are people, or sentient beings for that matter. You were talking about like what kept spirituality and what alive for me, and part of it was the nightlife. I mean, I remember being at a club in Boston and dancing at Avalon into the wee hours of sunrise, and someone, someone asking me, "Why do you dance?" And I said, "To free my soul." Because there's a thing about dance and rhythmic music and such in which it's very trance-like that you can get into.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of other people that were like-minded in the early 2000s where, it wasn't, I mean, Boston is one of the states where, in Massachusetts, one of the states where they stopped serving alcohol at 2 a.m., but we danced until the sun rose, you know, and yeah,
Ecstatic movement is very much a thing.
yeah,
And that does induce trance states. There's sections of mysticism dedicated, like the Sufi tradition, the whirling
Sufi and
dervishes
this.
of the Sufi. Like that's a that's just spinning as a form of movement to create connection with the divine. So absolutely dancing is divinity incarnate.
you
Absolutely.
know, and that rhythmic thump, 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 the Donna Summers.
Someone let the cake out in the rain and we are dancing through
I will survive. But
it.
I mean, I think that human beings are walking bags of water that were held together by our spirituality in the sense that spirituality has been one of the things that has driven things like social development as well as psychological research and development. That, it is in thinking that there is something more than me, that we can look for unity in other people, that we can look for purposes and such. And you don't have to tie yourself into dogma. Dogma should only ever be a tool. It should not be a destination. But the dogmas of Buddhism or Christianity or whatever, that these are tools that they exist for a reason. Going back to Joseph Campbell, it's like these tools, they keep popping up. You crush them down no matter how many times, it's going to form in a new way in a different place for the same function, you know. And that's because that's part of our makeup, where we are, it's in our DNA to think about more than ourselves. And I think that, we can overcome conflict and oppression and, you know, hate campaigns by not succumbing to them ourselves.
Hmm.
That it is very important for us to, instead of becoming question, why is L before G? Uh, because they held our hands while we died and no one else would touch us.
Yeah, for
You know,
real.
why about Q and T? Why is that in our alphabet? Because they threw the first bricks at Stonewall.
Yeah.
It's like divided we fall, and it's only that when we embrace love, not of one another, that we can start to embrace love about people that are different than ourselves. And to the people that question such things, or believe that hypermasculinity is the only way, I challenge them to think, why do they think that? And to think, is that the most loving thing, that you can do? Um, you know, um, One of my mentors, a little bit all over the place, I'm sorry, but one of my mentors, Reverend Kim Crawford Harvey of Arlington Street Church in Boston, she would preach about, you know, a focal point. Or she would also teach me about a focal point in our lives, a filter that you can think of for your actions as well as your words. Is it kind? Is
Hmm.
it necessary? Is it useful? And if
Yeah.
not, question what you're doing, question what you're saying. Like, do I need to say this? For whose benefit is this?
Yeah.
To whose detriment is it? And I think those are challenges in a society that has in the last 8 years villainized empathy um, to really stand strong. You know, I think that we should all benefit by reading Emerson and Thoreau and understanding things about how important it is to stand for what you believe and who you are, despite whatever anyone else says and thinks. Whether you have people applauding you or you have people stoning you, stay true to who you are
Yeah, 100%. And I
because they
also
will.
think absolutely. I also think it's important to ask yourself within like with it, as long as you're not betraying yourself, I think asking yourself is like, am I being kind in this moment is an important thing to just be aware of. Of course, if you're like getting beat up or something, that's not the time to think, am I being kind in this moment? But I think generally, if everyone led with that, just universally, like, how can I be a little bit more kind in this moment? Am I being conscious of like the people around me? Just
Mhm,
this sense of awareness that we exist outside of ourselves as well as like it's not all about this form that we're in
mhm,
because I also have this belief system my personal BS my personal belief system is that we're all like one organism existing in this time and space to experience itself from as many different perspectives as possible. So I think that very much there's no difference between you, me, the camera that's filming me right now, the light fixture that's next to me, my water bottle, your cup, like it's all just one thing. It's all just one experience happening unto itself. And it's almost like the universe, God, source, whatever you call it, your higher self. It's all just consciousness trying to become fully aware of itself somehow.
mhm.
That's
Um,
my thought process.
we're starting to touch the hem of God in science, where, and what I mean by that is we are looking at patterns and seeing that life is more than what we thought. And what I mean by that is that all life on Earth is connected through mitochondrial conduits and everything else, mushrooms of all things, roots of plants, energy waves that go through us, quantum entanglements, and all these things that what you're saying is not necessarily a deviation from science or a deviation from anything other than one perspective on what is the truth of the universe, and that is everything is connected. In a weird way, even though two things can never truly touch one another because you can't, according to science, the distance between me and you will always be infinite, even if we are thinking that we're physically touching, our atoms are not.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, we're quantumly entangled by energy. So our vibrations and our movements and our thoughts and what we consider of ourselves to be the individual, and there's many branches of science that are going back almost to, a Jungian and also Joseph Campbell type mythology where they're starting to say, you know, consciousness might just simply be the universe looking back at itself.
That's what I think. That's very much where I resonate.
You
Because
know,
have you ever studied Kabbalah at all?
no, I haven't studied Kabbalah. I did have a near-death experience once as a very small kid where I saw something that I later learned that people call the Akashic Library.
Oh, the Akashic Records, yeah.
Yeah. In which I drowned as a small kid, 3 years old, and I remember going to a place that reminded me of a library, an endless library. But what was weird was I knew what was written in every book, and every book was everything that ever lived. And I remember being told by two entities there that I couldn't stay, that I had to go back, and
You're
that
like, but I don't want to. I want to stay with the
I
books.
didn't. I didn't. And they were like, you got it because, you haven't filled your book yet.
Yeah.
Um, and, but it's weird because it's like our experiences right now is the universe's way of sort of experiencing itself. and us experiencing this aspect of ourselves, the ability to hurt even is a beautiful thing.
Well, I think people assume that comfort or ease is the goal while you're on this planet. And I don't disagree with that. I think comfort and ease are nice things, but I think that part of the reason we incarnate is to experience friction and separation. I don't think that separation is the goal by any means, but I think that it's necessary because if we wanted to remain in a place of oneness, we would have been not incarnated.
It's interesting because it's sort of maybe that oneness is the essence of our being, and we never stopped being one with the oneness, but it's just that has separated through this incarnation. Neil Donald Walsh talks about in a children's book of his, he wrote Conversations with God.
Hmm.
In his children's book that he wrote, it's about a little flame that, the sun has all these flames, right? And you are simply a flame of it, like a candle flame that has come here to Earth to experience the wind, to even experience being snuffed out in the end. And, that energy doesn't go away. It transmutes and goes back to the sun, in his story at least. And I think it's a lovely way of looking at individuality and the collective. A nice, good metaphor, maybe.
I think also when I started looking at people universally as all one whole organism, right? Like humanity is just one big thing experiencing itself, it gave me compassion for people that I previously did not hold compassion for. Like even people that I don't like, it became a lot easier to just be like, okay, this is just like an aspect of myself that I asked to experience before I came into this planet or that type of thing. It just like reframing my relationship with how um divinity works or how the like why we even do this incarnation separation thing. Um I think that looking at everybody as an extension or reflection of the capital S self um made this incarnated experience a lot easier.
Hmm. I definitely would say that is a good tool.
Yeah. So we're coming up on an hour, and I like to keep these at about an hour. So I would say, please leave us with a thought, and then if anyone is interested in your art, how can they find that? And then after you kind of close us out, I mean, we'll wave and we'll say goodbye, and then I'll say goodbye to you privately off camera too.
Okay. Um, You can reach my art. You can find my art in Facebook, at the Facebook page Random Acts of Sanity Artwork. That's the name of it. And Random Acts of Sanity because like I donate a portion of the money from my sales of my paintings to charities like the Trevor Project as well as Eighth Care Ocean State and other charities. So I try to plug my art into helping people, and I think kindness is one of the most random things in this world these days. And so I called it Random Acts of Sanity artwork. And um, I can give you the URL so you can attach that to this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. And do you have any final thoughts for them about like spirituality, how to live life to the best, anything like that?
Our lives are a dance, and there's going to be a lot of pain, and there's going to be a lot of beautiful aspects. It's only when we can see the entirety can we see the complete beauty. And I encourage people to never give up on themselves nor the people around them. That to remember that the painting is more than the brushstroke. So what you were going through now is not what defines you. Um, it is what the vibrations that you create with other people. Those acts of creation are beautiful, and you never know when your small acts, your random acts of sanity, your random acts of kindness are going to save somebody, or it's going to make an impact far greater than yourselves. So Even when you're feeling infinitely small, remember that your vibrations are infinitely large. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. That was a great send off. Okay, we're gonna wave goodbye to people and then I'll say bye to you off camera. So
Namaste.
bye.